Good afternoon. Chapter 6 involves the notions of memory. We're going to start specifically with the sensory registers, understanding that they work together, but at the same time, those sensory registers have different sorts of functions. So to begin, please understand that memory is dictated by what's called the information processing model. Now, what that means is that there are very simply 3 or 4 different ways that we receive information. Once we receive information through the senses, the brain encodes it in some way or other so that it can be stored. Once it's stored, then the challenge is being able to retrieve it when you need it. So, definitively, memory is an active system. It receives information from the senses, it organizes and alters that information as it stores it, and then retrieves the information from storage when it's also needed. Now, the information processing model involves encoding information, storage, as well as retrieval. Now, we have visual and auditory registers. Iconic memory is the visual sensory memory. An afterimage or an icon will be held in neutral form for about 1/4 to 1/2 of a second. Echoic memory is the auditory form of sensory memory, and it will last possibly as long as 4 seconds. Now, I'm sure that many of you have encountered a particular challenge. You're at some sort of party somewhere, maybe a holiday party or a family gathering with friends and other people or whatever. Maybe you're simply involved with a neighbor at his or her house, and there's a number of children running in and through the household at a particular time. You're having a conversation with an individual. We also know that your friend has the attention span of a Labrador retriever, and how you're having a conversation about how Labrador retrievers differ from German Shepherds. You have more people in the room talking about any sort of other subjects in general. You're trying to focus on the conversation you're having right in front of your face. Interested or not interested is really inconsequential. But the idea is that you're having all of this conversation and you're hearing all kinds of other information all around you. All of a sudden, one of those children comes bebopping through the room and says your name. Have you ever come across a mother or a father who does not know the child who says mom, dad, or whatever it is they call you? Every parent knows exactly which child is theirs when they speak that name, whether it's mom, dad, or they call them by a particular proper name. You stop what you're doing and reorient your focus to whomever, whether it's a child or an adult, who called you. Now, interestingly enough, we could look at that from a couple of perspectives. Were you paying attention to more than one conversation at a time? Or did you just simply happen to hear your name at the right time, just so you could respond on cue? Were you deliberately eavesdropping on some other conversation? All you can really recall is that you heard your name. Now, as a part of that process, you have experienced what Don Broadbent and Colin Cherry referred to as the cocktail party phenomenon. Part of the consciousness is being able to hold attention. We must attend to incoming stimuli in order to process it so that we can act on it in the appropriate manner. Now, does that imply that the case I noted just a moment ago, the listener was attending to a conversation behind her, or simply not focused on a conversation in such a way that he or she might have heard a child walk through the room and call them by name? Possibly, although the attention being paid in that conversation was not intentional. The listener in the conversation was engaged in what we know as dichotic listening, which basically refers to hearing on 2 different channels of sound, one in each ear, at the same time. Now, in dichotic listening, we listen to, or shadow is what it's called, the message to which we are currently attending, and then tune out the second unattended message. Nonetheless, some characteristics of that unshadowed message get through, and the listener then was shadowing a message in which he or she heard a particular name and then could not have told us the content or the characteristics of the unshadowed or the unattended conversation or the message from that conversation. How then did that person manage to hear his or her name? Certainly if they were not attending to the conversation. And Treisman in 1964 suggested that the actual word is dichotic. In dichotic listening, attention acts as an attenuator. In turn, it turns down the volume of unattended channels but does not completely block it from one's hearing ability or view. Morey in 1959 observed that it's very difficult to ignore particular sounds of our own names, certainly mom and dad if you have children, even if that sound is on an unattended channel. Dutch in 1963, followed by Norman in 1968, proposed that all channels reach the system, that all of the channels that reach into the system get some degree of attention and analysis. Specifically, the channels get attended just enough to be represented in the long-term memory. Now, although none of these models completely explain the attentional aspect of consciousness, they do at least give us some insights as to why we suddenly find ourselves, quote, eavesdropping, unquote, on the conversations of others after we have heard them mention our names. So, attention is selectively attending to some stimuli to the exclusion of another stimuli or other stimulus. Again, I've noted the cocktail party phenomenon. It's also important to remember that some of us encounter what's called inattentional blindness. How many times have you been driving somewhere only to realize that you haven't seen something that you know you should have seen? Could be a stop sign. It could be a place where you know a dog is known to run through the street. You might have not seen a squirrel dart out in front of your vehicle. When I was 10, I was riding my bicycle in a great hurry. What I actually did on my way to the place I was going was I ran through a stop sign. And what happened on my bicycle is that I got T-boned by a car. Now, I saw that car coming out of the corner of my left eye and managed to move my left leg out of the way as I was going to hop off of the right side of the bike. What ended up happening is that the way the car hit my bike, it threw the bike up onto the car, put a big black scratch mark on the hood of the car, and pitched me across the intersection. Someone heard about it, of course, heard all the ruckus and the commotion, saw some kid standing in the street bawling, and called the police like good citizens would do. I remember having a conversation with the policeman. There's not a stop sign over there. Now, first off, there's some other parts of the story that are in the back that you don't know about. I wasn't supposed to be away from school. That's to start. There was a stop sign there. I even said it was behind a bush. There wasn't a bush for 30 feet around that stop sign. It was plain and very seeable. I did not see it because I was focused on something else. That's called inattentional blindness. It happens to all of us all the time. It just depends on what the circumstance is, and hopefully we don't get hurt in the process. Now, memory is divided into long-term and short-term. There's not a medium term. Now, short-term memory is what we call working memory. It's the stuff we're doing all the time. My working memory is reading up through a set of notes, also glancing up and looking at you through the camera, and all this other sort of thing. Now, short-term and working memory is where information is held while it is in the conscious and it's being used. In other words, short-term and working memory is what's happening between your eyes right now. Now, the capacity of short-term memory, it boils down to this. It can hold 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. And when I say a chunk, typically we would use numbers. One of the things that happens when we're doing cognitive psychological assessment is that we do a number listening and repeating exercise. I repeat two letters or two numbers, 1, 8, and the client says 1, 8. Then I'll say 12, 2. The client will say 12, 2. Then I might say 5, 8, 3. The client's going to say 5, 8, 3. Doing this back and forth. And generally, short-term memory can hold about 7 plus or minus 2, in other words, somewhere between 5 and 9, little bitty chunks of information. When we don't rehearse it, which is a process of repeating information, when we don't rehearse it, short-term memory will last up to, but certainly very rarely will it ever extend past about 30 seconds. Now, if we're rehearsing it, you can stretch that out to some degree. Now, encoding, when it comes to short-term memory, is that verbal information is encoded phonologically. In other words, our ears are helping us manage that piece of information inside our brains. Now, the other types of information may be encoded visually if we're using our eyes, or from a tactile perspective if we're using our hands or our feet. Now, it's also possible for us to use what's called dual coding, which can be very effective when we try to maintain short-term memory. Now, when we're maintaining short-term memory, you must be reminded that we can lose it because of our failure to rehearse it. For example, go back to my numbers. I said 5, 8, 3. What usually is going to happen to a client is that once the client hears me utter some numbers, they start saying the numbers to themselves. And while I'm saying 5, 8, 3, that person in their head is also saying 5, 8, 3. And they'll say it to themselves once or twice, maybe 3 times before they give it back to me. That helps them get it right. Now, we call it rote rehearsal, and it often is quite inefficient. But in the right context, it can become very, very effective. Again, now simply remember that short-term memory, when it's not rehearsed, will not usually last longer than 30 seconds. If it is rehearsed, it can be held in short-term and working memory longer than that. But if short-term memory typically doesn't last longer than 30 seconds, what about longer-term memories? How do you remember the clothes that you might have worn last week? How do you remember the Christmas gift that you got 12 years ago? I remember receiving a toy. It was called a toss-across. It's an early version of cornhole, in a way. They had bean bags, and you played tic-tac-toe by tossing bean bags onto a little table that flipped either X's or O's. Now, how old was I when I received that gift? If I was going to guess, I would say probably about 9, give or take. Now, the fact that I can't remember how old I was isn't the point. The point is I can tell you about that gift and being relatively young when I received it. The reason I can remember that gift is because I got in trouble that day. And I'll explain how emotional characteristics can help increase one's longer-term memory here in just a bit. Now, long-term memory in general is the type of memory that the brain system uses that helps keep more or less information permanently. And what I'm telling you is that your brain is like a giant filing cabinet. And each particular category might be a drawer of files, or you might have different categories in different drawers and different files and different drawers that refer to different subjects or whatever else. What I'm saying is that if you can envision your memory to be somewhat like a filing cabinet, then what you'll need to do when you're retrieving information is simply go to the right file. You open the filing cabinet, pull out the folder that has the information you require, and you put the folder back when you're finished with it and go on about your business. Our brains typically store all pieces of information that we have ever encountered. When you're taking a test and you can't recall a particular piece of information, your brain likely remembers the information. The challenge is that you're having trouble retrieving it in a way that you can use it. Now, the capacity of long-term memory is relatively permanent as well as unlimited. There is no end to the amount of information that a human brain can store. When we're encoding in long-term memory, that is when information is more deeply processed so that it can be retained more effectively. Now, what we need to be able to do is extract meaning from the pieces of information rather than simply what we call rote rehearsal. That's the way to go. We also have what's called serial position effect, which means that there are places when we give primacy or recency effects that influence long-term memory and retrieval. A great example is a list. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, you've made yourself a grocery list. You forget your list for whatever reason. You get to the store, you realize you don't have it. You will remember the top 1, 2, or 3 items from the top of your list. You'll also remember some of the items from the bottom of your list. You'll forget the largest portion of the guts of your list. Give it a whirl. Think back in your mind and see if you've come across a time when you have done something similar. You remember the front part of your list and the back, but sometimes not the things in the middle. Now, that's about primacy and recency effects as it relates to longer-term memory. Now, to maintain long-term memory, you need to rehearse it, which is called rote rehearsal. That's the same sort of exercise you have with different sorts of subjects when you memorize information and barf it back for the test. That's rote rehearsal. You folks who are going to be nursing students are going to memorize a butt-ton of information, some of which you will never see again and you will never use again. I apologize, I got distracted for just a moment. We were talking about long-term memory as it relates to rote rehearsal, which is the repeating of information, hopefully to the point of being able to automatically recall it. Again, if I remember correctly, I said to you nursing students, or the students who will be nursing students later, you will memorize a butt-ton of information, some of which you'll never ever see again. You will not need to know, generally, which particular muscle operates the ability of my left nostril to flare when I breathe a certain way. I suspect that's not going to be something you have to remember in your medical work. Now, would you have to remember something that small for a test? Maybe. But what I'm getting at is that you will have to memorize and regurgitate a load of information. You will do that over and over and over again so that you get into the habit of being able to recall. It's like muscle memory when it comes to hunting, or muscle memory when it comes to driving. Those sorts of things we've already learned. Our muscles have learned how to do them. When it comes to learning information, we also function in a similar way. Now, elaborative rehearsal, which is not the same, of course, as rote rehearsal. Rote rehearsal is repeating things over and over. Elaborate rehearsal is much more the level of processing model, and it is more about the amount of work performed on the information that you're trying to remember and how it influences the retention rate and the recall of that information. Now, what that means in very plain language is that you have to work, process, encode pieces of information and link them together in ways that help you remember them. Being able to attach a memory or a particular emotion to a memory also helps with recall. We organize our memories in what's called a schemata. That's a single one, a scheme of sorts. And a scheme is like a story or like a schematic diagram that helps with electronic information. It is a framework that helps you organize the information you're working with. And the idea is to figure out how it is you are able to recall information most effectively for you, and then study in a similar way. Now, as an example, When we're talking about memory, being able to help you with some of your study habits will make part of this a little easier to understand. Again, your nursing students are the best examples on the front end because you're going to have to remember lots of information, a lot of which you'll never use again. Now, the only way to do that is to memorize it and to repeat it over and over and over and over and over so that you don't even think it, just the right answer comes out of your mouth. Now, when you're having to do something in English and you're having to remember, or history, and you're having to recall pieces of information or dates that help you string together sentences to communicate a larger idea, being able to connect the dots in your mind's eye is what's going to save you. And the idea will be to connect pieces of information together so that you can create a scheme of how that information fits together, like little puzzle pieces, so that you see the larger picture. Now, there are a handful of different types of longer-term memory. There is episodic memory, which is exactly what you would think it sounds like. It is the memory related to personal events that you have experienced. Semantic memory is memory related to facts and information. My address is XYZ, whatever street. That is a semantic memory. Procedural memory, which is going to be the memory for certain types of skills, habits, conditioned responses, which would be things like driving, writing, however it is, cooking in many contexts. Emotional memories are learned emotional responses that occur in relation to various different stimuli. And we've also got explicit and implicit memory. Now, an explicit memory, something X meaning outside, is a memory that a person has, and the person is aware that he has that memory. The fact that I can remember this toss across from when I was 8 or 9, however old I was, that's an explicit memory. I'm aware that I remember that. An implicit memory is internal, and it's a memory that is often very difficult to bring into one's conscious awareness. The implicit part of the memory related to my toss across is not being able to remember the exact age. Now, if you're having trouble remembering something, one way to help is to use a process called priming. Now, priming is a process that gives you the ability to intake a particular small piece of information that will likely increase your ability to provide a response that you're looking for. Now, one way to see that would be to talk about car engines from many, many years ago. Most of you have most likely not ever seen a car engine or worked with a car engine that did not have fuel injection. Way back in the day, your parents might be able to tell you about some of these sorts of cars, maybe, if not your parents, certainly your grandparents. Now, that type of car, if, for example, you ran out of gas, you would have to get a tank of some kind to get gas back into your car. You would put some gas in the gas tank. You would also drip a little bit of gasoline into the carburetor. That's called priming. You're putting a little bit of gas into the carburetor to help ignite or to turn over the engine to help it start. That way your battery doesn't get wasted having to pump the fuel from the gas tank all the way through up into the carburetor. You prime that pump, as it were. It happens when people drill water wells. They prime the pump with water so that it makes the initial pumping process easier. If you can remember a small piece of information related to a subject you're trying to remember and articulate deeper pieces of, it is going to help you remember more likely the things that you're trying to remember so that you can put the whole picture together. Now, the tip of the tongue phenomenon is a process that helps us understand that there are non-conscious aspects of the memory. How often have you told someone, I'm trying to tell you it's right on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't get it out. That piece of memory is falling away and you're having a retrieval challenge of sorts. The idea is to move around that. Wait. Take a break for just a second. You'll discover the memory will show back up for you, and the information that you require will also materialize. Now, surprisingly enough, memory is biological, which simply means that it is a physiological process that takes place inside the human brain. Everything you experience in life, certainly every piece of information you experience through any of your five senses, all of that information is processed, encoded, stored, retrieved, whatever, in your brain. The fact that wherever you happen to be sitting, if you are listening or watching this, you could reach over, touch your right cheekbone. The fact that your finger feels your cheekbone, you think it's happening between your finger and your cheekbone, but where it's really happening is in your brain. And your brain is telling your finger and your cheekbone that it's feeling the other. Again, hopefully it doesn't sound too goofy, but memory is basically a neurological activity. It is the firing and the exchange of neurochemical information that takes place in the brain. It deals with certain brain structures, proteins, all that kind of stuff related to memory formation. A process called long-term potentiation increases the synaptic responsiveness, which helps us remember better. When we consolidate memory, the consolidation process will consist of physical changes that take place with neurons inside your brain. Now, where does your memory, or where does your brain store the memories it requires? I mean, can you go back to your occipital lobe and say, in the back part of my occipital lobe on the left-hand side are all the memories that relate to eating chicken fried steak? First off, that sounds kind of goofy because it wouldn't work that way, because the occipital lobe refers to one's ability to see, not to eat or to taste, which would be related to the mouth. If it's related to the mouth, that process takes place in a different part of the brain, not in the occipital lobe. So, where does your brain store those memories? Procedural memories, things that we do all of the time, operating your computer's mouse or your touchpad or your ability to get a drink of something. That is a process that your body knows how to do. Driving your car or your truck, riding a bicycle, whatever. That is a procedural memory. That procedural memory is stored in the cerebellum. The cerebellum, by the way, is the oddly walnut-looking, it's much larger than a walnut, but it has the look of a walnut, sort of, on the back part of your brain underneath the occipital lobe. Now, don't forget the cerebellum is also the part of the brain that helps you be oriented in time and space so that you don't fall down. Again, it's an interesting place for procedural memories to be stored. Short-term memories are stored in the prefrontal and the temporal lobes of the brain's cortex. Temporal lobes over here on the sides. They run on either side just above your ears. And the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex up front. Semantic and episodic memories may be stored in the frontal and temporal lobes as well. Memory for fear related to objects is most likely stored in the amygdala. The amygdala is a little bitty almond-shaped organ that's part of your brain that exists way down in the center toward the core. The hippocampus is the piece of the brain that helps move short-term memory into longer-term memory. Now, it's responsible for the storage of, as well as newer long-term memories. If a person has to have the hippocampus removed for whatever reason, the ability to store any new information is lost. A person has a stroke, for example. or some other sort of brain injury that has damaged the hippocampus. What often will occur is that people cannot form new memories. So if you're at the hospital and somebody has a brain injury that has damaged the hippocampus, what's going to happen is that you're going to meet your doctor, or this person is going to meet his or her doctor, and they're going to have a conversation. Then the patient's going to leave the doctor's office. If that person encounters the doctor 2 minutes later in some other place in the hospital, in the chow line, for example, that patient will not have any recollection of having visited with this doctor and may very well start a conversation all over again about the same thing they've already chatted about. It's an interesting phenomenon. But if the hippocampus gets damaged, the ability to make new memories goes away. Sleep, please hear me, sleep is significant when it comes to the formulation and formation and consolidation of memory. Sleep plays what we call a demonstrative role in memory formation. When we don't sleep well, it will take away from our ability to have good memories. Now, most younger students, and some older students for that matter, will spend hours and hours and hours studying things. Such individuals will often try to cram all of this information into their brains before the test tomorrow. Some people will pull an all-nighter and not ever go to bed. Now, some of you won't believe me, but I'll try to get you to trust me here and try it. You would be better off reading through your notes once or twice a day for whatever subject, and then doing the same thing the night before the test. If you are repeating information constantly, scanning through your notes, not spending oodles of time going over them, but simply scanning through your notes, do that instead of staying up all night the night before trying to memorize it and cram it in there. Go to sleep like normal. Assuming you sleep well, chances are your ability to recall will be much more significant. Trust me here. Not getting enough sleep is detrimental to your memory. So, what about forgetting? How do we forget, basically? How is it that we can't remember? Again, there is some biological information related to forgetting, but please remember, sometimes what we call forgetting is simply poor recall and may not necessarily be forgetting. Now, biologically speaking, decayed memory is a way we forget. Now, the decay memory theory basically assumes the presence of a physical memory trace that, if it's not used over time, goes away. For example, you know what? 2 times 2 is going to be 4. Every time you do it, 2 times 2 is going to be 4. If you encounter some sort of brain damage or some kind of brain trauma, you may forget that 2 times 2 is 4. You're not able to practice it. As a result, you may not remember. When you don't remember, that's because the memory has decayed. If I was betting, there's probably an image or a drawing of some sort in your textbook in Chapter 6 that shows the decaying process. Amnesia, at least retrograde amnesia, is the disruption of a memory for events that occurred shortly before an injury. Retrograde meaning before. Now, amnesia is a condition when we can't remember. Part of it is deciding if we can't remember before a trauma or after a trauma. If we don't remember, you're driving a car and you had a car accident. Okay. Sometimes a bonk on the head will limit your ability to recall what was happening right before the accident. Fair enough. That's called retrograde amnesia. Will you ever remember? Maybe, maybe not. Anterograde amnesia is the inability to remember something after a brain trauma of some sort for at least a certain amount of time. Happens sometimes in car accidents. An individual will have a car accident, get bonked on the head, and quote unquote come to or become aware of whatever and not remember anything that happened after the car accident before they quote unquote woke up, and it's 6 hours later at the hospital. They will not be able to tell you what has transpired between the accident and when they can quote unquote start remembering again. Two different types of amnesia. One of them refers to not being able to remember before an accident. The other refers to not being able to remember after an accident. Now, our experiences of forgetting deal with what we call interference. Now, proactive interference is when, if I remember correctly, proactive interference is when learning something new messes up our ability to remember something we already know, which means that retroactive interference means that something we've already learned is keeping us from being able to learn or to remember something new. If any of you took a foreign language in high school, doesn't make me any difference what the language was. If you took it in high school, most likely you didn't take it till you were a sophomore, a junior, or a senior at best. Students usually don't take a foreign language as freshmen. They might, but not usually. It usually doesn't happen till a junior year in many cases, or it used to not. The fact that you know English may inhibit your ability to learn Spanish. There will be times, depending on how well you develop your Spanish skill, that your Spanish might influence in a negative way your ability to speak good English. If you learn another language, you learned how to speak Spanish in high school and you decide you want to learn German when you get to college, the fact that you learned Spanish may influence your ability or your lack of ability to learn German, because those two language structures are very different. So again, the interference is either proactive or retroactive. There are situational factors which play a role in how it is we remember. We call them context-dependent or state-dependent memories. What this means is that if you're having trouble remembering something, see if you can put yourself in your mind's eye into the same situation where you were when you learned the information. In other words, if we're talking about how to drive, a good one that came up for me, and it may be kind of a petty example, but it works real well. The cruise control for my truck is on the left-hand side of the steering wheel. The cruise control for my wife's CRV is on the right. I'm accustomed, the car I had before my truck was also on the right. So I'm accustomed to using my right index finger or my thumb to adjust cruise control. When I got this truck, I had to convert to left hand. Okay, now that's a contextual thing. I was driving my wife's car the other day, and I reached with my left hand to deal with the cruise control because I'm accustomed to using my cruise control. It's a contextual thing. Oh, Scott, it's not over there, it's over here. So I just simply changed thumbs. But that's context dependent, depending on which car I'm driving in. Same sort of idea when it comes to the state or an emotional state. If I was angry when I learned something about my spouse and I'm having trouble remembering it later, then if I'm angry when I'm trying to remember it, chances are I'll have a better opportunity to remember. Again, it's just a context versus state. Now, when we're reconstructing memories, they are usually put together from bits and pieces of information. Now, there are a handful of special topics that we'll at least refer to when we're talking about memory. Your culture, for example, influences so much of your world. Culture will exert a significant impact on your memory. Autobiographical memories, of course, are memories of specific events or conditions or circumstances that refer to yourself. I remember being run over by the car. I was in the 5th grade. I was 10. That's about me and my world. I'm going to assume that most of you have never been run over by a car. In some cases, we encounter what's called extraordinary memory. That might include photographic memory. It's also called eidetic memory. It's an imagery sort of thing. Individuals who deal with memory contests, for example, some of them are called mnemonists, and they are highly skilled at using memory techniques to remember information. In other words, a lot of times they'll play with cards, and they'll be able to take a deck of cards and thumb through them and tell you, oh, card number 52 was the ace of spades. And they'll know exactly where that card is. How? It's because of the ability to link that piece of information to something else that they already know. Flashbulb memories are memories that require very little effort to place information into the longer-term memory storage place. Flashbulb memories are usually emotional or traumatic events that lead to a flash of that information. Memories will seem very vivid and detailed, as if the person were looking at a snapshot. Eyewitness testimony, you hear about similar things when people are talking about court cases and legal issues. Please know this: eyewitness testimony may not be as accurate as people assume, certainly as accurate as law enforcement would assume. Interestingly enough, what research has discovered is that if we're not sure of a memory, we'll make it up, is basically what it boils down to. All of us have seen a bank get robbed on television or at a movie or at a movie screen on your TV, whatever. We've seen banks get robbed, right? So let's just say, for the sake of example, that I'm in downtown Dallas one day and I happen to be at a bank of significance and that bank gets robbed. Well, I'm going to be thrust into an anxiety-provoking situation. And as a result, I'm going to think about the robbery circumstance. Did I have to lie on the floor face down? Did someone threaten to shoot me or to kill me? Was I asked for information or whatever else? If, when legal officials are interviewing me after the process and I can't remember something specifically, my brain may, not always will, but may fabricate a piece of information to stick into that memory slot. If my brain does that, it is going to use information it already has. The only way I would have known about that information would have been information I had seen somewhere else. In other words, watching a bank being robbed on TV could influence my ability to remember an actual bank robbery. Now, again, that's referred to as eyewitness testimony, and eyewitness testimony is not nearly as valid in court circumstances anymore. Same thing with lie detector tests. When using lie detector machinery, that testimony is also considered somewhat questionable at best. Now, when it comes to eyewitness testimony, a step further from that we would refer to as being able to, quote-unquote, recover memories. Now, recovered memories, you may hear about them more in contexts related to therapy. You might hear about them as it relates to someone who is accusing someone else of some sort of abuse. Often what occurs in therapeutic situations is that a client will recover a memory of some sort of traumatic event. Now, it is quite possible that the quote-unquote recovered memory is a BS memory. It could have actually occurred at the suggestion of the therapist, which makes recovered memories very troubling when you're dealing in legal circumstances with potential abusers. Did those events truly occur, or did the memory of those specific events come about because the therapist may or may not have suggested certain issues related to those memories? Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Now, memory is great fun. You take information from Chapter 5 and learning skills, and you put that together with memory skills. Then what happens is that you can start to put together a better understanding of why you do what you do when you do it. And I told you on the front of the semester, one of my jobs is to help you better understand when you do what you do and why. And this is going to help you. When you start putting these pieces of information together, you'll start connecting dots. And when you start connecting dots, the picture will come into view, and you'll find that you remember things much more appropriately. Now, if I can help with anything as it relates to memory, give me a call, drop me an email, whatever. I'm happy to discuss that with you. If you want some study tips, let me know. If you want to talk about study tips when we meet in our Zoom conversation this week, that's fine. I'm happy to do that in whatever way I can help. I'll try. But until then, have a good afternoon.